Hello everyone. So we are back with chapter number 8 of Modern History by Bipin Chandra. This chapter is named Economic Impact of British Rule. Now if you're still with us, thank you again for listening to this chapter and great work in completing the previous chapters. This is called consistency and this is what really gives the results. All the best to each and every one of you listening. Here it goes. The British conquest had a pronounced and profound economic impact on India. There was hardly any aspect of Indian economy that was not changed for better or for worse during the entire period of British rule down to 1947. Disruption of traditional economy. The economic policies followed by the British led to the rapid transformation of India's economy into colonial economy whose nature and structure were determined by the needs of the British economy. In this respect, the British conquest differed from all previous foreign conquests. The previous conquerors had overthrown Indian political powers but had made no basic changes in the country's economic structure. They had gradually become a part of Indian life, political as well as economic. The peasant, the artisan, the trader had continued to lead the same type of existence as before. The basic economic pattern, that of the sufficient rural economy, had been perpetuated. Change of rulers had merely meant change in the personnel of those who appropriated the peasant surplus. But the British conquerors were entirely different. They totally disrupted the traditional structure of Indian economy. Moreover, they never became an integral part of Indian life. They always remained foreigners in the land, exploiting Indian resources and carrying away India's wealth as tribute. The result of this subordination of the Indian economy to the interest of British trade and industry were many and varied. Ruin of artisans and craftsmen. There was a sudden and quick collapse of urban handicrafts industry which had for centuries made India's name a byword in the markets of the entire civilized world. This collapse was caused largely by competition with the cheaper imported machine goods from Britain. As we have seen earlier, the British imposed a policy of one-way free trade on India after 1813, and the invasion of British manufacturers, in particular cotton textiles, immediately followed. Indian goods made with primitive techniques could not compete with goods produced on a mass scale by powerful steam operated machines. The ruin of Indian industries, particularly rural artisan industries, proceeded even more rapidly once the railways were built. The railways enabled British manufacturers to reach and uproot the traditional industries in the remotest villages of the country. As the American writer D.H. Buchanan has put it, the armor of the isolated self sufficient village was pierced by steel rail and its life was ebbed away. The cotton weaving and spinning industries were the worst hit. Silk and woolen textiles fared no better, and a similar fate overtook the iron, pottery, glass, paper metals, guns, shipping, oil pressing, tanning, and dyeing industries. Apart from the influx of foreign goods, some other factors arising from British conquest also contributed to the ruin of Indian industries. The operation practiced by East India Company and its servants on the craftsmen of Bengal during the second half of the 18th century, forcing them to sell their goods below the market price and to hire their service below the prevailing wage, compelled a large number of them to abandon their ancestral professions. In the normal course, Indian handicrafts would have benefited from the encouragement given by the company to their export, but this operation had an opposite effect. The high import duties and other restrictions imposed on the import of Indian goods into Britain and Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries, combined with the development of modern manufacturing industries in Britain, led to the virtual closing of the European markets to Indian manufacturers. After 1820, the gradual disappearance of Indian rulers and their courts, who were the main customers of handicrafts, also gave a big blow to these industries. For instance, the production of military weapons was dependent entirely on the Indian states. The British purchased all their military and other government stores in Britain. However, Indian rulers and nobles were replaced as the ruling class by British officials and military officers who patronized their own home products almost exclusively. This increased the cost of handicrafts and reduced their capacity to compete with foreign goods. The ruin of Indian handicrafts was reflected in the ruin of towns and cities which were famous for their manufacture. Cities which had withstood the ravages of war and plunder failed to survive British conquest. Dhaka, Surat, Murshidabad, and many other populous and flourishing industrial centers were depopulated and laid waste. By the end of 19th century, urban population formed barely 10% of the total population. William Bentinck, the Governor General, reported in 1834 and 5, the misery hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching in the plains of India. The tragedy was heightened by the fact that decay of the traditional industries was not accompanied by the growth of modern machine industries, as was the case in Britain and Western Europe. Consequently, the ruined handicraftsmen and artisans failed to find alternative employment. The only choice open to them was to crowd into agriculture. Moreover, the British rule also upset the balance of economic life in villages. The gradual destruction of rural crafts broke up the union between agriculture and domestic industry in the countryside and thus contributed to the destruction of self-sufficient rural economy. On the one hand, millions of peasants who had supplemented their income by part time spinning and weaving now had to rely overwhelmingly on cultivation. On the other, millions of rural artisans lost their traditional livelihood and became agricultural laborers or petty tenants holding tiny plots. They added the general pressure on land. Thus, British conquest led to industrialization of the country and increased dependence on the people on agriculture. No figures for the earlier period are available, but according to census reports between 1901 and 1941, alone the percentage of population dependent on agriculture increased from 63.7 to 70%. This increasing pressure on agriculture was one of the major causes of the extreme poverty of India under the British rule. In fact, India now became an agricultural colony of manufacturing Britain, which needed it as a source of raw materials for its industries. Nowhere was the change more glaring than the cotton textile industry. While India had been for centuries the largest exporter of cotton goods in the world, it was now transformed into an importer of British cotton products and an exporter of raw cotton. Impoverishment of the peasantry. The peasant was also progressively impoverished under the British rule. Although he was now free from internal wars, his material condition deteriorated and he steadily sank into poverty. In the very beginning of the British rule in Bengal, the policy of Clive and Warren Hastings of extracting the largest possible land revenue had led to such devastation that even the Cornwallists complained that one third of Bengal had been transformed into a jungle inhabited only by wild beasts. Nor did improvement occur later in both the permanently and temporarily settled zamindari areas. The lot of peasants remained unevenable. They were left into mercies of zamindars who raised rents to an unbearable limits, compelled them to pay illegal dues and perform forced labor or begar, and oppressed them to diverse other ways. The condition of cultivators in top Rotwari and Mahalwari areas were no better. Here the government took the place of zamindars and levied excessive land revenue, which was in beginning fixed as high as one third to one half of the produce. Heavy assessment of land was one of the main causes of the growth of poverty and deterioration of agriculture in the late 19th century. Many contemporary writers and officials noted this fact. For instance, Bishop Heber wrote in 1826, "Neither native nor European agriculturist, I think, can thrive at the present rate of taxation. Half the gross produce of the soil is demanded by the government. In Hindustan, northern India, I found a general feeling among the king's officers that the peasantry in the country's province are on a whole worse off, poorer and more dispirited than the subjects of the native provinces." And here in Madras, where the soil is generally speaking poor, the difference is said to be still more marked. The fact is, no native prince demands the rent which we do. Even though the land revenue demand went on increasing year after year, it increased from 15.3 crores in 1857 to 8 to 35.8 crores in 1936 and 7. The proportion of the total produce taken as land revenue tended to decline, especially in the 20th century as the princes rose and production increased. No proportional increase in land revenue was made as the disastrous consequence of demanding extortionate revenue became obvious. But by now, the population pressure on agriculture had increased to such an extent that lesser revenue demand of later years weighed on the peasants as heavily as the higher revenue demand of the earlier years of the company's administration. Moreover, by the 20th century, the agrarian economy had been ruined, and the landlords, moneylenders, and merchants had made a deep inroads into the village. The evil of high revenue demand was made worse because the peasant got little economic return for it. The government spent very little on improving agriculture. It devoted almost all its entire income to meeting the needs of British Indian administration, making the payments of the direct and indirect tribute to England, and in serving the interests of the British trade and industry. Even the maintenance of the law and order tended to benefit the merchant and the moneylender rather than the peasant. The harmful effects of the excessive land revenue demand were further heightened by the rigid manner of their collection. Land revenue had to be paid promptly on the fixed dates even if the harvest had been below normal or had failed completely. But in bad years, the peasant found it difficult to meet the revenue demand even if he had been able to do so in good years. Whenever the peasant failed to pay land revenue, the government put up his land for sale to collect the arrears of revenue. But in most cases, the peasant himself took this step and sold part of his land to meet the government demand. In either case, he lost his land. More often, the inability to pay revenue drove the peasant to borrow money at high rates and interest from the moneylender. He preferred getting into debt by mortgaging his land to a moneylender or to a rich peasant neighbor to losing it outright. He was also forced to go to the moneylender whenever he found it impossible to make both ends meet. But once in debt, he found it difficult to get out of debt. The moneylender charged high rates and interest through cunning and deceitful measures such as false accounting, forged signatures, and making the debtor sign for larger amounts than he had borrowed. Got got the peasant deeper and deeper into debt till he parted with his land. The moneylender was greatly helped by new legal system and the new revenue policy. The pre-British times, the moneylender was subordinated to the village community. He could not behave in a manner totally disliked by the rest of the village. For instance, he could not charge usurious rates of interest. In fact, the rates of interest were fixed by the usage of public opinion. Moreover, he could not seize the land of the debtor. He could at most must take the possession of debtor's personal effects like jewelry or parts of his standing crop. By introducing transferability of land, the British revenue system enabled the moneylender or the rich peasant to take possession of the land. Even the benefits of peace and security established by the British through their legal system and police were primarily reaped by the moneylender, in whose hands the law placed enormous power. He also used this power to pursue of the purse to turn the expensive process of litigation in his favor and to make the police serve his purposes. Moreover, the literate and the shrewd moneylenders could easily take advantage of the ignorance and illiteracy of the peasant to twist the complicated process of law to get favorable judicial decisions. Gradually, the cultivators in the Rotwari and Mahalwari areas sank deeper and deeper into this debt, and more land passed into the hands of moneylenders, merchants, rich peasants, and other moneyed classes. The process was repeated in the Zamindari areas, where the tenants lost their tenancy rights and were ejected from the land or became subtenants of the moneylender. The process of transfer of land from cultivators was intensified during the periods of scarcity and famines. The Indian peasant hardly held any savings for critical times, and whenever crops failed, he fell back upon the moneylender not only to pay land revenue but also to feed himself and his family. By the end of 19th century, the moneylender had become a major curse of the countryside and an important cause for growing poverty of the rural people. In 1911, the total rural debt was estimated rupees 300 crores. By 1937, it amounted to rupees 1800 crores. The entire process became a vicious circle. The pressure of taxation and growing poverty pushed the cultivators into debt, which in turn increased their poverty. In fact, the cultivators often failed to understand that the moneylender was an inevitable cog in the mechanism of imperialist exploitation, and turned their anger against him as he appeared to be the visible cause of their impoverishment. For instance, during the revolt of 1857, whenever the peasantry rose in revolt, quite often its first target was the attack on the moneylender and his account books. Such peasant actions soon became a common occurrence. The growing commercialization of agriculture also helped the moneylenders come merchant to exploit the cultivator. The poor peasant was forced to sell his produce just after the harvest and at whatever price he could get, as he had to meet in time the demands of the government, the landlord, and the moneylender. This placed him at mercy of the grain merchant, who was in position to dictate the terms and who purchased his produce as much less at the market price. Thus, a large share of the benefit of the growing trade in agricultural produce was reaped by the merchant, who was very often the village moneylender. The loss of land and the overcrowding of land caused deindustrialization and lack of modern industry, compelled the landless peasants and ruined artisans and handicraftsmen to become either tenants of the moneylenders and zamindars by paying rack rent on or agricultural laborers at starvation wages. Thus, the peasantry was crushed under the triple burden of the government, the zamindar, and the moneylender. After these three were taken their share, not much was left for the cultivator and his family to subsist on. It has been calculated that in 1950s and 51, land rent and moneylenders' interest amount to rupees 1400 crores, or roughly equal to one third of the total agricultural produce of the year. The result was that the impoverishment of the peasantry continued, as also an increase in the incidence of famines. People died in millions whenever droughts or floods caused the failure of crops and produce scarcity. This was part 1 of chapter number 8 of the economic impact of British rule. Stay tuned, we'll be back again with the part 2, where we will start with the old zamindar, ruin of old zamindars and the rise of new landlordism. Hello everyone, so here we begin with part 2 of chapter number 8, the economic impact of British rule. The topic is ruin of old zamindari and rise of new landlordism. Here it goes. The first few decades of the British rule witnessed the ruin of the most of the old zamindars of Bengal and Madras. This was particularly so with Warren Hastings' policy of auctioning the rights of revenue collection to the highest bidders. The permanent settlement of 1793 also had a similar effect in the beginning. The heaviness of the land revenue, the government claimed 10/11 of the rental, and the rigid law of collection, under which the zamindari estates were ruthlessly sold in case of delay in payment of revenue, wreaked havoc for the first few years. Many of the great zamindars of the Bengal were utterly ruined and were forced to sell their zamindari rights. By 1815, nearly half of the landed property of Bengal had been transferred from the old zamindars who had resided in the villages and who had traditions of showing some consideration to their tenants, to merchants and other moneyed classes who usually lived in towns and who were quite ruthless in collecting to the last pie what was due from tenant, irrespective of the difficult circumstances. Being utterly unscrupulous and possessing little sympathy for tenants, they began to subject the latter to rack renting and ejectment. The permanent settlement in North Madras and temporary zamindari settlement in UP were equally harsh on the local zamindars. But the condition of the zamindars soon improved radically. In order to enable zamindars to pay the land revenue in time, the authorities increased their power over the tenants by extinguishing the traditional rights of tenants. The zamindars now set out to push up the rents to the utmost limit. Consequently, they rapidly grew in prosperity. In the Ryotwari areas too, the system of landlord-tenant relations spread gradually. As we have seen above, more and more land passed into the hands of moneylenders, merchants, and rich peasants who usually got the land cultivated by tenants. One reason why the Indian moneyard classes were keen to buy land and become landlords was the absence of effective outlets for investment of their capital in industry. Another process through which this landlordism spread was that of subletting. Many owner cultivators and occupancy tenants having a permanent right to hold land found it more convenient to lease out land to land hungry tenants at exorbitant rent than to cultivate it themselves. In time, landlordism became the main feature of agrarian relations not only in the zamindari areas but also in Ryotwari areas. The remarkable feature of the spread of landlordism was the growth of sub-infeudation and intermediaries. Since the cultivating tenants were generally unprotected and overcrowding of land led tenants to compete with one another to acquire land, the rent of land went on increasing. The zamindars and the new landlords found it convenient to sublet their right to collect rent to other eager persons on profitable terms. But as rents increased, subleasers of land in their turn to sublet their rights in land. Thus, by a chain process of large number of rent receiving intermediaries between the actual cultivator and the government sprang up. In some cases in Bengal, their number went as high as 50. The conditions of the helpless cultivating tenants who had ultimately to bear the burden of maintaining this horde of superior landlords was precarious beyond imagination. Many of them were little better than slaves. An extremely harmful consequence of rise and growth of zamindars and landlords was the political role they played during the India's struggle for independence. Along with the princes of protected states, many of them became the chief political supporters of the foreign rulers and opposed the rising national movement. Realizing that they owed their existence to the British rule, they tried hard to maintain and perpetuate it. Stagnation and deterioration of agriculture. As a result of overcrowding of agriculture, excessive land revenue demand, growth of landlordism, and increasing indebtedness and the growing impoverishment of the cultivators, Indian agriculture began to stagnate and even deteriorate, resulting in extreme low yields per acre. Overall, agricultural production fell by 14% between 1901 and 1939. The overcrowding of agriculture and increase in the subfeudation led to subdivision and fragmentation of land into small holdings, most of which could not maintain their cultivators. The extreme poverty of the overwhelming majority peasants left them without any resources with which to improve agriculture by using better cattle and seeds, more manure and fertilizers, and improved techniques of production. Nor did the cultivator rack rented by both the government and the landlord have any incentive to do so. After all, the land he cultivated was really his property, and the bulk of the benefit which agricultural improvements would bring was likely to be reaped by the horde of absentee landlords, moneylenders. Subdivision and fragmentation of land also made it difficult to effect improvements. In England and other European countries, the rich landlords often invested capital in their land to increase its productivity with a view to sharing in increased income. But in India, the absentee landlords, both old and new, performed no useful function. They were more rent receivers who had often no roots in the land and who took no personal interest in beyond collecting rent. They found it possible and therefore preferred to increase their income by further squeezing their tenants rather than by making productive investments in their lands. The government could have helped in improving and modernizing agriculture, but the government refused to recognize any such responsibility. The characteristic of financial system of British India was that while the main burden of taxation fell on the shoulders of the peasant, the government spent only a very small part of it on him. An example of this neglect was the peasant and agriculture was the stepmotherly treatment meted out to public works and agricultural improvement. While the government of India had spent by 1905 over 360 crores of rupees on the railways which were demanded by British business interests, it spent the same period less than 50 crores of rupees on irrigation, with which would have benefited millions of Indian cultivators. Even so, irrigation was only field in which the government took some steps forward. At time when agriculture all over the world was being modernized and revolutionized, Indian agriculture was technologically stagnating. Hardly any modern machinery was used. What was worse was that even ordinary implements were centuries old. For example, in 1951, there were only 909 lakh 30,000 iron plows in use, while wooden plows numbered 31.8 million. The use of inorganic fertilizers was virtually unknown, whereas a large part of animal manure, that is, cow dung, night soil, and cattle bones, was wasted. In 1922 to 3, only 1.9% of all cropped and land was under improved seeds. By 1938 and 9, this percentage had gone up to only 11%. Furthermore, agricultural education was completely neglected. In 1939, there were only 6 agricultural colleges with 1306 students. There was not a single agricultural college in Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, and Sindh, nor could peasants make improvement through self study. There was hardly any spread of primary education or even literacy in rural areas. Development of modern industries. An important development in the second half of the 19th century was the establishment of large scale machine based industries in India. The machine age in India began when the cotton, textile, jute, and coal mining industries were started in 1850s. The first textile mill was started in Bombay by Kovasji Nanaboy in 1853 and the first jute mill in Rishra, Bengal in 1855. These industries expanded slowly but continuously. In 1879, there were 56 cotton textile mills in India employing nearly 43,000 persons. In 1882, there were 20 jute mills, most of them in Bengal, employing nearly 20,000 persons. By 1905, India had 206 cotton mills employing nearly 196,000 persons. In 1901, there were over 36 jute mills employing nearly 111,000 people. The coal mining industry employed nearly 1 lakh persons in 1906. Other mechanical industries developed during the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century were cotton gins and presses, rice flour and timber mills, leather tanneries, woolen textiles, sugar mills, iron and steel works, and such mineral industries such as salt, mica, and saltpetre, cement, paper, matches, sugar, and glass industries developed during the 1930s. But all these industries had a very stunted growth. Most of the modern India industries were owned and controlled by the British capital. Foreign capitalists were attracted to Indian industry by prospects of high profits. Labor was extremely cheap. Raw materials were readily and cheaply available for many goods. India and its neighbors provided a ready market. For many Indian products such as tea, jute, manganese, there was a ready demand the world over. On the other hand, profitable investment opportunities at home were getting fewer. At the same time, the colonial government and officials were willing to provide all help and show all favors. Foreign capital easily overwhelmed Indian capital in many of the industries. Only in the cotton textile industry did Indians have a large share from the beginning. In the 1930s, the sugar industry was developed by Indians. Indian capitalists had also to struggle from the British beginning against the power of British managing agencies and British banks. To enter a field of enterprise, Indian businessmen had to bend before the British managing agencies dominating that field. In many cases, even Indian owned companies were controlled by foreign owned or controlled managing agents. India also found it difficult to get credit from banks, most of which were dominated by British financiers. Even when they could get loans, they had to pay high interest rates while foreigners could borrow on much easier terms. Of course, gradually Indians began to develop their own banks and insurance companies. In 1914, foreign banks held over 70% of all bank deposits in India. By 1937, their share had decreased to 57%. British enterprises in India also took advantage of its close connection with British suppliers of machinery and equipment, shipping, insurance companies, marketing agencies, government officials, and political leaders to maintain its dominant position in Indian economic life. Moreover, the government followed a conscious policy of favoring the foreign capital as against Indian capital. The railway police of the government also discriminated against the Indian enterprise. Railway freight rates encouraged foreign imports at the cost of trade in domestic products. It was also more difficult and costlier to distribute Indian goods than to distribute imported goods. Another serious weakness of the Indian industrial effort was the almost complete absence of heavier capital goods industries, without which there can be no rapid and independent development of industries. India had no big plants to produce iron and steel or to manufacture machinery. A few petty repair workshops represented engineering industries, and a few iron and brass foundries represented metallurgical industries. The first steel in India was produced only in 1913. Thus, India lacked such basic industries as steel, metallurgy, machine, chemical, and oil. India also lagged behind in development of electric power. Apart from machine-based industries in 19th century, also witnessed the growth of plantation industries such as indigo, tea, and coffee. They were almost exclusively European in ownership. Indigo was used as a dye in textile manufacturers. Indigo manufacture was introduced to India in end of 18th century and flourished in Bengal and Bihar. Indigo planters gained notoriety for their oppression over the peasants who were compelled by them to cultivate indigo. This operation was vividly portrayed in the famous Bengali writer Deen Bandhu Mitra in his play Neel Darpan in 1860. The innovation of a synthetic dye gave a big blow to the indigo industry and it gradually declined. The tea industry developed in Assam, Bengal, South India, and the hills of Himachal Pradesh after 1850. Being foreign owned, it was held by the government with grants of rent free land and other facilities. In time, the use of tea spread all over India and it also became an important item of export. Coffee plantations developed during this period in South India. The plantation and other foreign owned industries were of hardly any advantage to Indian people. Their profits went out of the country. A large part of their salary bill was spent on highly paid foreign staff. They purchased most of their equipment abroad. Most of their technical staff was foreign. Most of their products were sold in foreign markets and foreign exchange so earned was utilized by Britain. The only advantage that Indians got out of these industries was the creation of unskilled jobs. Most of the workers in these enterprises were, however, extremely low paid and they worked under extremely harsh conditions for very long hours. Moreover, conditions of near slavery prevailed in the plantations. On whole, the industrial progress in India was exceedingly slow and painful. It was mostly confined to cotton and jute industries and tea plantations in the 19th century, and to sugar and cement in the 1930s. As late as 1946, cotton and jute textiles accounted for 40% of all workers employed in factories. In terms of production as well as employment, the modern industrial development of India was paltry compared to the economic development of other countries or with India's economic needs. It did not, in fact, compensate even for the displacement of the indigenous handicrafts. It had little effect on the problems of poverty and overcrowding of land. The paltriness of Indian industrialization is brought out by the fact that out of a population of 357 million in 1951, only about 2.3 million were employed in modern industrial enterprises. Furthermore, the decay and decline of the urban and rural handicraft industries continued unabated after 1858. The Indian Planning Commission has calculated that the number of persons engaged in processing and manufacturing fell from 10.3 million in 1901 to 8.8 million in 1951, even though the population increased by nearly 40%. The government made no effort to protect, rehabilitate, reorganize, and modernize these old indigenous industries. Moreover, even the modern industries had to develop without government help and often opposition to British policy. The British manufacturers looked upon Indian textile and other industries as their rivals and put pressure on the government of India to not encourage but rather to actively discourage industrial development in India. Thus, British policy artificially restricted and slowed down the growth of Indian industries. Furthermore, Indian industries, still in the period of infancy, needed protection. They developed at a time when Britain, France, Germany, and United States had already established powerful industries and could therefore compete with them. In fact, all other countries, including Britain, had protected their infant industries by imposing heavy custom duties on import of foreign manufacturers. But India was not a free country. Its policies were determined by in Britain and in interests of the British industrialists who forced a policy of free trade upon their colony. For the same reason, the government of India refused to give financial or other help to the newly founded Indian industry as was being done at the time by the governments of Europe and Japan for their own infant industries. It would not even make adequate arrangements for technical education, which remained extremely backward until 1951 and further contributed to industrial backwardness. In 1939, there were only 7 engineering colleges with 2217 students in the country. Many Indian projects, for example, those concerning with the construction of ships, locomotives, cars, aeroplanes, could not get started because of the government's refusal to give any help. Finally, in the 1920s and 30s, under the pressure of the rising nationalist movement and Indian capitalist class, the government of India was forced to grant some tariff protection to Indian industries. But once again, the government discriminated against the Indian owned industries. The Indian owned industries such as cement, iron, steel, glass were denied protection or gave inadequate protection. On the other hand, foreign dominated industries such as the match industry were given protection as they desired. Moreover, British imports were given special privileges under the system of imperial preferences, even though Indians protested vehemently. Another feature of Indian industrial development was that it was extremely lopsided regionally. Indian industries were concentrated only in few regions of cities of the country. Large parts of the country remained totally underdeveloped. This unequal regional economic development not only led to the wide regional disparities in income but also affected the level of national integration. It made the task of creating a unified Indian nation more difficult. An important social consequence of even the limited industrial development of the country was the birth and growth of two new social classes in Indian society: the industrial capitalist class and the modern working class. These two classes were entirely new in Indian history because modern mines, industries, and even means of transport were new. Even though these classes were formed a very small part of the Indian population, they represented new technology, a new system of economic organization, a new social relations, new ideas, and new outlook. They were not weighed down by the burden of old traditions, customs, and styles of life. Most of all, they possessed all India outlook. Moreover, both of them were vitally interested in the industrial development of the country. Their economic and political importance and roles were therefore out of all proportion to their numbers. Thank you everyone for tuning in. This was part 2, chapter number 8 of Economic Impact of British Rule. Next, we will be talking about poverty and famines in the next part. Thank you all for tuning in. All the best, everyone. Hello, everyone. So, here we begin the final part of chapter number 8 from Modern History, Bipin Chandra. The chapter name is Economic Impact of the British Rule, and we will be starting with the topic Poverty and Famines. So, here goes the topic. A major characteristic of British rule in India and the net result of British economic policies was the prevalence of extreme poverty among its people. While historians disagree on the question whether India was getting poorer or not, under British rule there is no disagreement on the fact that throughout the period of British rule, most Indians always lived on the verge of starvation. As the time passed, they found it more and more difficult to find employment or to make a living. British economic exploitation, the decay of indigenous industries, and the failure of modern industries to replace them, high taxation, the drain of wealth to Britain, and a backward agrarian structure leading to the stagnation of agriculture and the exploitation of poor peasants by the zamindars, landlords, princes, moneylenders, merchants, and the state gradually reduced the Indian people to extreme poverty and prevented them from progressing. India's colonial economy stagnated at low economic level. The poverty of the people found its culmination in a series of famines which ravaged all parts of India in the second half of 19th century. The first of these famines occurs in western UP in 1860 to 61 and cost over 2 lakhs of lives. In 1865 and 6, a famine engulfed Orissa, Bengal, Bihar, Madras and took toll of nearly 20 lakh lives. Odisha alone losing 10 lakh people, more than 14 lakh person died in the famine of 1868 to 70 in western UP, Bombay and the Punjab. Many states in Rajputana, another affected area, lost one-fourth to one-third of their population. Perhaps the worst famine in the Indian history till then occurred in 1876 to 78 in Madras, Mysore, Hyderabad, Maharashtra, western UP and the Punjab. Maharashtra lost 8 lakh people, Madras nearly 35 lakh, Mysore nearly 20% of its population and UP over 12 lakh. Drought led to a countrywide famine on 1896 and 97, which affected over 9.6 crore of people, of whom nearly 45 lakh died. The famine of 1899 to 1900 followed quickly and caused widespread distress. In spite of official efforts to save lives through provision of famine relief, over 20 lakh people died. Apart from these major famines, many other local famines and scarcities occurred. William Digby, a British writer, has calculated that in all, over 28,825,000 people died during the famines from 1854 to 1901. Another famine in 1943 carried away nearly 3 million people in Bengal. These famines were and high losses of life in them indicate the extent to which poverty and starvation had taken root in India. Many English officials in India recognized the grim reality of India's poverty during 19th century. For example, Charles Eliot, a member of the Governor General's Council, remarked, "I do not hesitate to say that half of the agricultural population do not know from one year's end to another what is it to have a full meal." And William Hunter, the compiler of Imperial Gazetteer, considered that 40 million of the people of India habitually go through life on insufficient food. The situation became still worse in 20th century. The quantity of food available to an Indian declined by as much as 29% in the 30 years between 1911 and 1941. There were many other indications of India's economic backwardness and impoverishment. Colin Clark, a famous authority on national income, has calculated that during the period of 1925 to 34, India and China had the lowest per capita incomes in the world. The income of an Englishman was 5 times that of an Indian. Similarly, average life expectancy of an Indian during 1930s was only 32 years, in spite of the tremendous progress that modern medical science and sanitation had made. In most of the West European and North American countries, the average age was already over 60 years. India's economic backwardness and poverty were not due to niggardliness of nature, they were man-made. The natural resources of India were abundant and capable of yielding, if properly utilized, a high degree of prosperity to the people, but as a result of foreign rule and exploitation and of a backward agrarian and industrial economic structure, in fact, as the total outcome of its historical and social development, India presented the paradox of a poor people living in rich country. The poverty of India was not a product of its geography or the lack of natural resources or some inherent defect in the character and capabilities of the people, nor it was a remnant of the Mughal period or the pre-British past. It was mainly a product of the history of the last 2 centuries. Before that, India was no more backward than the countries of Western Europe, nor were the differences in standards of living at the time very wide among the countries of the world. Precisely during the period the countries of the West developed and prospered, India was subjected to modern colonialism and was prevented from developing. All the developed countries of the today developed almost entirely over the period during which India was ruled by the Britain, most of them doing so after 1850. Till 1750, all the differences in living standards were not wide between different parts of the world. It is interesting in this connection to note that the dates of beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the British conquest of Bengal virtually coincide. The basic fact is that the same social, political, and economic processes that produced industrial development and social and cultural progress in Britain also produced and then maintained economic underdevelopment and social and cultural backwardness in India. The reason for this is obvious. Britain subordinated the Indian economy to its own economy and determined the basic social trends in India according to her own needs. The result was stagnation of India's agriculture and industries, exploitation of its peasants and workers by the zamindars and landlords, princes, moneylenders, merchants, capitalists, and the foreign government and its officials, and the spread of poverty, disease, and semi starvation. Thank you, everyone. This was chapter number 8 of Modern India. The chapter's name was Economic Impact of the British Rule. We have finished the chapter, and thank you, everyone, for listening and tuning in. All the best, and take care of yourselves. Thank you, everyone.